If you don't want the Godzilla web shell, make sure you patch your Zoho ServiceDesk instance.
Andy, I understand there's a vulnerability that's been recently discovered in the Zoho Manage Engine ServiceDesk Plus, that help desk software, and maybe you could kind of tee up the conversation on that one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Bleeping Computer has a report about an APT group that was previously observed exploiting a flaw in the Zoho Manage Engine 80 Self-Service Plus software, which is a different software by the same vendor. That same group has actually now been observed exploiting a different vulnerability in the Zoho ServiceDesk Plus software. The vulnerability itself is an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability, which is very bad. It's kind of one of the worst that you can have. And they're using it to install the Godzilla web shell onto victims. So the clever bit about this, though, is they're actually installing the Godzilla web shell as an Apache Tomcat filter, which actually is able to bypass certain web shell protections that the Service Desk software has in place already, which is pretty clever. So this recent vulnerability is actually one of a couple. I already mentioned one of them. There's a newer one even still, but focusing on this one here, what are your thoughts with this most recent one, John?
There are a couple of interesting aspects to this. First of all, as far as latest data is that there's no public proof of concept code for this exploit. So there's a specific group that's using it and leveraging it against vulnerable hosts. And they do have a CVE for it, but it's not like there's one specific group. It's not like everybody in the world has this now and they're all scanning the internet for it. And so that's a little better, but still not great, because if you have, you have an instance of Service Desk and it's exposed to the internet, especially, you definitely want to patch. I understand that Zoho mentioned that the uptake on patches, because they do have a patch available for this already, but people aren't, I guess, realizing that this is an issue, customers, and that they need to patch. So, maybe us spreading the word a little bit might help a few people, share some awareness that they should patch it. The other thing I thought was interesting, they didn't go into a lot of detail that I saw, but that whole filter concept, that it was deployed at Apache Tomcat as a filter. So I think what that means, I've used web filters before in other things like Apache, where you can kind of set up anything that matches this pattern, maybe in types of the URL or things in the context of the request, it will actually do something different as part of the filter. So with that, depending on how you deploy it, you could theoretically have it, you don't know what to look for necessarily. You're not looking for somebody browsing to your website / webshell.jsp or anything like that. It could be any URL, and something that they've embedded in there is what the filter, the Tomcat jar that they stuffed in there is actually looking for, and then it might stuff that into the response somehow, so in a hidden way or something, which is really brilliant, because you can really hide that very well. From most security responders' eyes, they might not pick up on it very easily, I would think. So that's interesting. The other thing about it is that this is a pretty bad vulnerability in terms of it seems like it's really easy to exploit if you know how. There's just two requests that you need to make to a REST API. Both of them are done in an unauthenticated fashion. The first, you just send a request to the REST API that allow you to upload an executable, and then the second request will, let's say, launch that executable. So it's pretty simple to exploit. There's not a lot, a high barrier to entry in terms of skill set needed here if you know how to do it.
Yeah. So I think the name of the game here is patch as quickly as you can. And to that end, Zoho actually addressed the initial vulnerability with the ad service Plus vulnerability in September, mid-September, I think. And just recently, in late November, they actually notified customers of active exploitation for that the first vulnerability. So, like you mentioned, it's easy to exploit this thing. Because the first one was an authentication bypass with remote code execution against a REST API. And then this one obviously is unauthenticated RCE against an API as well. So, the barrier to execution is pretty low in terms of complexity. And we're seeing active exploitation, at least as of a few weeks ago. So it's very important if you've got this software in place in your enterprise, especially if it's internet facing, as you mentioned, make sure you go out there and patch. At this point, it's critical, I would say.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Definitely, definitely patch as soon as possible, and maybe monitor your servers to see it's even been attempted. I'm not quite sure you would look for. There might be some indicators out there that Zoho is sharing, but it sounds like they're kind of keeping it a little tight-lipped for the moment, so as to kind of keep it not so easily discoverable by others in terms of because it sounds like it's once you know how, it's pretty easy. So even like saying, look for a web request for this type of thing might lead somebody to believe, oh, I know how I could do this, one of those kind of things. So anyhow, I was going to say one other thing is that would be good to do if you're not already doing is do so. I don't know that a lot of people do this with their the jars that they deploy on their Tomcat server or whatnot, or the WAR files, the web archives. Have some good auditing in place to look for any changes to those deployed objects in your Tomcat server to see if there's anything new that's been deployed. You could do that. There's a lot of open source tools or even commercial tools that look for changes in certain directories where those kinds of things would be stored, which normally shouldn't change very often unless you're doing a software upgrade or something like that of your own, especially on a production platform. So that would be another thing I would recommend people, if they're not already doing, to take a look at, so that even in general for all websites, it's pretty good. If you know that most of your code on your website is pretty static, looking for any changes in those doc routes or anything within that path of the web application that shouldn't be changing in terms of a file on the system, that would be a good thing to go look for.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I think if you look at the vectors for these CVEs, that they're APIs. So even further recommendation for APIs is just make sure you're enforcing authentication and doing it the right way. We've seen a lot of websites, when you look at them and you tamper with them a little bit, a lot of the websites will go out, or the vulnerable ones will go out and create a back-end call that's sort of hidden from the user, but not so hidden from kind of like the more tech-savvy user. And a lot of the time with developers that I've spoken to, a lot of them are just like, well, who's going to look at that API? Who's going to pull that out? And it's part of this particular flow. So it's not intended to be taken out of that flow, whatever the reason may be. Just understand that when you're making that call, if it's on the internet and it's being made from the client, any client can just pull that. Anybody can just pull that out and make that request. It goes back to a saying I read in this book a long time ago: don't trust the client. Don't trust anything that the client sends you. Just as a developer's perspective, and I think that holds true here. Don't trust that the client is authenticated already. Don't trust that what they're sending in is validated data or it's filtered data or anything like that. Basically, just treat it as completely untrusted data. And I think in this case, it would have fixed those two things right away. But unfortunately, those APIs weren't built with that in mind, or maybe they were, and something just kind of fell through the cracks. So just make sure when you're building APIs, you don't trust the client.
Right, 100%. I agree with you. And having been a developer in a previous life, I've run across that same experience where a lot of developers are like, "Yeah, but who's going to do that?" And I'm like, well, somebody who wants to rip us off is going to do that. So, we should really need to pay attention to these types of things because, in doing so, you could, take over maybe a customer's account or whatever. We know we've seen lots of in other types of things, we've seen insecure direct object reference type things where if you just change a value that the client is sending, now I'm the identity of somebody else entirely, which is a really bad mistake to allow to happen. Like you said, never trust the client.
Yeah.
So.
And I wanted to mention too one last thing. If you Google for this recent spat of Zoho software vulnerabilities, there's a ton of articles, of course, because I think there's at this point there's like 3 kind of main ones. But they did put out, as in Zoho, put out a tool called rcescan.bat that you can run on a server, and it'll look for the presence of certain zip files, and it'll look for a backdoor, and it'll actually tell you if it's compromised. So if you've got this running in your enterprise and you're kind of unsure whether or not you've been compromised in any way, I would seek this out. I think I actually just found it. It's the Hacker News has an article that references that tool. So I would suggest going out and getting that tool if you're one of the affected people or organizations, and run that tool on those affected servers and get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, that's good. I didn't know about that, and I agree. Just make sure you get it from them. Not somebody else.
Don't get a cracked version.
Right. Don't get not that it needs to be cracked, but calling back to an earlier story. But yes, I know there's been people put tools out for various things, and somebody says, "I've got a better version of that tool. You want to use this one instead." Just be careful. Get it from the vendor, and maybe if it's readable, the source code, I would take a look at it, especially if it's pretty simple to follow, to make sure it's not doing anything it shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
So.
The referenced tool here, I'm looking at the URL. It's downloads.zohocorp.com, and it's detector.zip. So that at least is the link that the Hacker News has. But like you mentioned, just make sure you're getting it from a legitimate source and do your due diligence, man. Pop open the source code and just make sure it's not doing something funny. Because just because it comes from Zoho doesn't mean just be
we're all paranoid.
Just be paranoid. Yes. Trust nothing.
Yeah, I agree.